Hi, I'm Tim Leet, and I am the Executive Director of Heart of Character. Welcome to Fostering a Sense of Community in Online Learning. As I record this, it's early July, summer 2020, and there's a lot of uncertainty in what returning to school is going to look like this fall. Most of you watching this finished last year in an online learning, remote learning environment, and if you're like me, it was had its ups and downs. But one of the things that's true is we entered that experiment with relationships with the kids, with a sense of community that we had already built over the first half of the year, the first 2/3 or even 3/4 of the year. The prospect of going back and beginning school in any kind of remote capacity is a different sort of proposition, isn't it? And it requires us to think hard about what can we do in this new environment to establish that sense of community, to build those relationships that we know are so important in education. Education, obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here. Education is obviously not simply transmitting information back and forth. It's not this transactional experience. It's an emotional, invested experience. And we use this idea of community as a placeholder for all kinds of things, emotional investment, care, and how do we do that? How do we do that through this interface that you're watching me through? We'll start this presentation with just a few early thoughts, followed by a little deeper dive into what I'm going to mean when I talk about belonging, the most sort of salient basic psychological need when we're talking about building community. What is belonging? And how can I contrast fitting in from a sense of belonging? It's really an important thing to understand. And that'll constitute maybe the first third of the video. And the bulk, though, will be devoted to practical strategies and advice that you can use in your classroom. And then later, a few suggestions at a slightly higher level, maybe things that will appeal to administrators or school leaders or program leaders in some capacity that take a look at the division or the school at a higher level. Okay, so let's get started. And you're going to want to build, no matter where you are, you're going to want to build intentional strategies around school priorities and your priorities. I've underlined the word intentional there to draw attention. Well, let me say it a different way. I remember my first year of teaching. It was over 20 years ago, and I remember how much thought and planning went into the relationship building part of school. And as I anticipated time with kids, how do I connect with them? How do I build these relationships? How do I help them build relationships with each other? And then how do we plug into the larger narrative of school life? And how do I facilitate this community building? That was my curriculum and my academic part, but this part about community building was a very conscious and deliberate thing. And despite the fact that I've been teaching over 20 years, I think of this fall and my feelings are that I'm a new teacher again. And I want to suggest that it might be helpful for all of us to think, I'm a first year teacher. You're going to see this purple circle a lot here in the next several slides, and I'm going to use it. I say my classroom, I should have put quotes around it because it's a placeholder for any space where an adult, you, or leader of some type is responsible for setting the tone, right? And so classroom is the easiest place to imagine that happening. So let's just picture our students arriving outside of our classroom door. and students are different. And so, sticking with my simple geometry theme, let's just say these kids are starting to congregate outside my door, and it's time for me to invite them in. In the fall, that might look like bringing kids into my Zoom session in person. Of course, it looks a different way that you're familiar with. But in the end, you still have different kids with different needs and different abilities and different backgrounds, all arriving for an experience that you are curating. Because as the adult in charge, we maintain and set a very particular classroom culture. And that classroom culture most often is an extension of the culture we are most comfortable with. And cultures have all sorts of practices and rituals and artifacts that are a part of it. Emotional expressiveness is a big one. How close do you stand to kids? Do you ever touch them? How hard and fast are you about punctuality? Am I focusing on individuals? Are my desks separated and isolated and spread out in a grid, or are they focused more in clusters pointed toward each other? There are a lot of things we do, mostly unconscious, to set up a particular classroom culture. I'm going to just take two shapes, and I'm going to use those to illustrate the difference between three ways to think about that kid's experience in your space, right? Some kids are going to misfit. Some kids are going to do their best to fit in. And then there's a third one, the one we're aiming for, which is the experience of belonging. Okay. That is a rundown and an explanation of belonging. And I elaborated on, I spent a lot of time on it because I think it's really important, especially as we return to school this particular fall, right? The COVID crisis is very real and it's on everybody's mind, but that's not the only issue. That's not the only crisis in this country right now. And so we want to be especially mindful of community, not just as a place for those who are willing, but consider the names you struggle most with. You know, if you look like me, you're probably not struggling with Emma, Matt, and Jared. You know, there are other names that are giving you a lot more problems. And when you think about it, you know that for a lot of these kids, they are experience school often in the margins. Maybe they're not in the heart of every default assumption in the culture. And so that symbolic power of the name is that much more significant for those students. So I strongly recommend to lean into those names that you know are going to give you trouble, because the symbolic power of using it and pronouncing it correctly is very powerful. Number 5 is to tell stories. I promise that in a sagging moment in a lesson, in person or online, if you begin a sentence with, "I remember a time when I was in high school," all the heads will come up and all the wandering attention will come right back to you, okay? Or middle school or 4th grade or whatever age it is that you work with. If there is an introduction to storytelling time. And if you begin to narrate in that way, you will bring them in. Learning is an emotional experience, and storytelling is a fantastic way to engage the emotion. Number 8, have fun together. If you've taught more than one day in your life, you know how powerful laughter is in bringing a community together. There are so many ways you can do this. We did it with show and tell in the spring. We did it with theme days. You can have funny hats. If you are in a situation where you have faculty or students who for reasons are unable to attend in person at all, and there are many reasons that might be true. Figure out a way and a person who's going to do a driveway visit, who's going to drive by. Maybe it's a conversation through a closed window, but please don't let those faculty, staff, or students go months while others are convening and seeing each other in person, isolated at home without a friendly face showing up in the driveway. And thank you for being there for our kids.